The earliest balls, of course, were made of wood, especially when the game was played on the ground. I cannot tell you, although I've done a lot of research, when ivory balls were introduced. I just have never found out. But clearly the ivory balls were a great improvement over the wooden balls, which would be rough and wouldn't keep their shape. But now ivory also had a disadvantage. Tremendous improvement on wooden balls for durability and so on, but ivory has a grain in it. And rather, in exactly the same way as timber behaves, and this was a problem with wooden beds as well, in damp conditions, timber and also ivory will swell, and in dry conditions it will shrink. And in both those materials, the expansion and contraction only occurs side grain and not end grain. And again, in my younger days, there was a constant stream of people coming into the shop with sets of ivory balls that they wanted them readjusting, and of course they had to be restained because all ivory is white. And again, like timber, it will take up more stain on the end grain, it will soak in on the end grain, and more or less stay on the surface side grain.
What about the animal rights lovers? Surely they couldn't have been too happy about elephants being slaughtered to provide a game of billiards?
You're in the days before animal rights people were active, I'm afraid. Sad to tell you, the best ivory for making billiard balls came from the small tusks of female elephants. So they were popping off the lady elephants to provide billiard balls. Now, the figures still exist to show that at the beginning of this century, so just think about the year 1900, it required the slaughter of 12,000 elephants a year just to provide the United Kingdom with ivory billiard balls. And as they played billiards all over Europe, North America, Australia, etc., the actual slaughter of elephants must have been dreadful. And it was the lady elephants that were preferred.
Ivories were going out just as Fred Davis was coming in. Their performance was unpredictable, and as you could only make 4 or 5 balls from each tusk, the raw material was pretty costly. Of course, Fred, you were only a young boy when you last played with ivories. What were they like to play with?
Well, I always found them, you know, I didn't do a lot of playing because I was a very young age in those days. But I found them very attractive to play with. As you can see, and this was normal for ivories. The red was never completely covered, and that always, I thought, gave it an attractiveness when it was just running on the table. Because it, you know, it wasn't as the balls are today. The white balls are also were also interesting in as much as the grain in the ivory shows up quite plainly, and when side was applied, it created quite an attractive picture.
The unpredictability of ivories didn't stop the old-timers making breaks of 1,000 or more, and this was the first repetitious scoring method they developed, known as the spot stroke, endlessly potting the red off its spot, 3 points for each pot. Was just a gambling or recreational game, but like most sports, it organised itself into more formal competitive structures. The first match for the Billiards Championship took place at the St James's Hall, London, in 1870 between John Roberts Sr. and William Cook. The Prince of Wales was among the full house. Cook was only 20 when he became the first champion, but he in turn lost the title to Roberts' son, John Roberts Jr., the W.G. Grace of billiards. Not only was he the best player of his day, but its most imaginative entrepreneur in terms of selling the game and its equipment. Roberts Jr. was a great showman with an instinctive appreciation that the public could only take so much of the repetitious methods of scoring which the best players had perfected. One aspect of this dilemma was a running battle between the top players and the rule makers. The spot stroke had been barred in 1898, but the anchor cannon, an even deadlier and more repetitious scoring method, was being perfected by Tom Rees of Oldham. In 1907, at Burroughs and Watts in Soho Square, London, he released his secret weapon against an opponent he wasn't particularly fond of, one Joe Chapman. Rees manoeuvred the two object balls into the two jaws of the top left-hand corner pocket, and for 5 weeks he went relentlessly on and on at a rate of about 10,000 points per session. The gentry would pop in from their clubs to see an hour or so on their way home. Some insomniacs found it solved their problem, and from time to time Rees exercised his wit against the hapless Chapman. What sort of chalk do you use? And how do you find the table? Were the kind of quips with which he amused himself until Chapman stormed out. The match target of 500,000 points was reached with Rees still in anchor cannon position. The break was 499,135, unfinished. As a result of this, the anchor cannon was barred, and so too was another Rees development, the pendulum cannon. This required a lot of skill to manoeuvre the two balls into the pocket jaws, but once they were there, it was a passport to more or less endless scoring. In 1910, the focus turned to in-offs, and here at the Royal Hotel in Cardiff, a 19-year-old Australian demonstrated the in-off game to boring, deadly perfection, going in-off the red in the same middle pocket 289 times in succession, 3 points for each in-off. George Gray could make 1,000 break in this fashion any time he felt like it. Back home in Australia, he learnt to play not with ivories but with composition balls, which were much more reliable and predictable in all conditions. Not that these synthetic balls had been developed without incident. In 1868, a New Yorker, John Wesley Hyatt, discovered that the collodion, which printers brushed onto their fingers to protect them from cuts, hardened when it was dried and could be made into false teeth, piano keys and billiard balls. But one of the early problems of the new ball was that collodion was so highly inflammable that if you struck it too hard, it could explode. Naturally, there have been some refinements since then. Between 1927 and 1972, the chief ingredient was crushed cow's shin bones, but this in turn became too expensive and a new synthetic composition was developed. Anyway, using composition balls, Gray's in-off game was so good that British professionals insisted that the championship was played using ivories, so Gray never won the title. Perhaps this was all for the best, because in-offs into the middle pocket, relieved only by the occasional top pocket in-off to bring the red round again, were deadly to watch. The rule makers then brought in the so-called hazard limit. This limited consecutive pots and/or in-offs to 25 and then to 15, the current limit, to promote all-round play. One of the great all-round players and characters was Melbourne Inman, whose rivalry with Rees, the cannon specialist, was legendary. Inman beat Rees in the semi-finals of the 1919 championship and then went on to beat H.W. Stevenson for the title. Lord Alveston, who was then president of the Billiards Association, had only a few days earlier sentenced the notorious Dr. Crippen to death. As his lordship was about to hand over the championship trophy, up stood Rees and said, "Excuse me, my lord, if you knew as much about Inman as I do, you'd have given Crippen the cup and sentenced Inman to death." The 1920 and 23 champion was Willie Smith, perhaps the only truly great player who ever gave the impression of playing the billiards of the common man. He seldom played a shot which the good amateur couldn't. The difference was that he hardly ever missed and that one easy shot invariably led to another. The trouble with Willie Smith's all-round game, though, was that he could only rarely beat the specialists, the close cannon artists who comprised the Big Four. This was how, in the 20s and 30s, Walter Lindrum, Joe Davis, Tom Newman and Clark McConaughey dominated the scene, eventually killing the game as a public entertainment and thus paving the way for snooker to take over. As good as these four were, they weren't playing nursery cannons all the time. The top-of-the-table game, an alternating mixture of pots and cannons, was a scoring method that Smith and the Big Four had in common. Here's Tom Newman, 6 times champion between 1921 and 1927.
Most of my breaks are made at the top of the table, round about the spot here. There's all kinds of very interesting moves, and if you only pick out the right stroke, you can keep up here for quite a long time, providing you've got anything like a good touch. Pop the red one on the cushion. Leave the... Lower up to the cannon, gently. There we are, back from where we started, practically. Pop the red again. Slow screw cannon.
This is the correct way to leave the 3 ball. Joe Davis succeeded Tom Newman as world professional billiards champion in 1928 and went on to win the title 4 times in succession. Because Joe's name became synonymous with snooker, it tends to be forgotten what a marvellous billiards player he was.
Joe was a 1,000 break plus player, and he was good, certainly as good as anything that we had in this country. The exception being, of course, Walter Lindrum, who was far and away the greatest player there's ever been. They say it's a borderline case between genius and
madness.
Yes, and I think there must be something to that, because I do honestly believe that Walter Lindrum is one of the very few sporting personalities that one should or could use the word genius. You know, he originally was a right-handed player, and he suffered an injury to one of his fingers and just changed over and played left-handed. You can't think of anything more amazing than that.
It was said about Walter Lindrum that the only thought he'd got in his head was about billiards.
Well, I could imagine that. He was a genius where the game was concerned, and particularly when he was, if you like, he had some purpose. One occasion, of course, being against Willie Smith, who had made the mistake of badly beating Walter's elder brother, Fred Lindrum. And of course, Willie was, by our standards, was a great player. And I think the victory over Fred Lindrum had given him the wrong impression that he was going to do the same against Walter. Of course, eventually, it didn't happen straight away, but eventually they played, and Walter Lindrum beat him by something like 20,000 points in a couple of weeks' match. And Willie Smith, of course, was really a great player, a wonderful player. And he was but he was the type of player, of course, who played the game on the same basis that you would see in any club. The same type of game. But he played it very much better, of course. But he must have had wonderful stamina, because it does take a lot of stamina to play all-round billiards, particularly if you're going to go into the, you know, which Willie did. He once made a break of 2,500. And how he was able to stand up is amazing.
Willie was a bit of a maverick personality, wasn't he? He seemed to enjoy arguing as much as playing.
Oh, yes. He was arguing with every player he played. I know Joe and Willie had great differences at one stage, and it was only in the latter part of Willie's career that they patched things up and were really great friends. And as you know, they they always had an annual match of billiards and snooker at Leicester Square Hall in London.
The World Championship became so disfigured by arguments about conditions and contracts that the best players weren't always in it. There was a lot of face to lose, particularly if there wasn't much money on offer. So exhibition matches and tournaments between the big four captured most of the attention. Bill Camkin, seen here in the middle with Lindrum, Davis, Newman and McConaughey, not only promoted but also refereed the first World Professional Snooker Championship final in May 1927. Camkin was also responsible for the staging of numerous multi-city international tournaments. In one of them, Newman met Lindrum at Thurston's, whose 172-seat match arena in Leicester Square, London, was the mecca of the professional game between the Great Wars.
This is the first occasion in the history of billiards that a sound film has been made as part of an important game. This is Walter Lindrum, and this is Tom Newman with his famous chin.
55. 58. 63. 65. 87. 89. 532, love rate. 900. 3. 9. 25. Okay.
This was the golden age of billiards. Outside the professional circuit, the game was in a healthy state. There was a British Empire Championship, which was to evolve into the World Amateur Championship. And women's billiards also commanded some attention.
I only remember two personalities with the ladies, and one was Joyce Gardner, and the other Thelma Carpenter. But Joyce Gardner, of course, made more progress, I think, in the general terms of the game than Thelma Carpenter, although I don't think there was very much in it in ability at billiards.
The late Joyce Gardner had a professional career which lasted 40 years. As Fred mentioned, her greatest rival was Thelma Carpenter, seen here with Clark McConaughey in 1932.
Well, you won the championship, Miss Carpenter. Now what about playing one of those long jimmies that stood you in such good stead during the championship?
Well, I'll try.
Beauty.
Will you give us some of your close cannons now, please?
Sure. Is this what you want?
Something really clever. What can you make out of this?
Well, what about a fast shot? Pop the red into the basket and jump into the hat for a cannon. Look out.
Clark McConaughey had tremendous determination, and he was the type of character that Addy said to me that he was going to swim from this country to New Zealand. I would take it that he would.
He was a great physical fitness fanatic, wasn't he?
Yes, oh yes, and And of course, the other players took advantage of this to a certain extent, because he always started rather nervously, strangely enough, when he started a match. And to make matters even worse, of course, the other players would, out of fun, get him to show some of his feats, like picking up a chair with one hand, you know, and raising it above his head, and you know, he'd think nothing about walking round the place on his hands, and which of course is not in keeping with the delicate game of billiards. But it was all done in fun.
Meet a man, 2 games to let a tough break get him down. Arthur Gandrel, who lost his left forearm at Ypres. Most men find it hard to pocket one ball with 3 shots. Watch how Arthur pockets this one.
In the 1920s, Arthur Gandrel, who'd lost an arm in the First World War, could still play better with 1 than most people could with 2. Frustrating 100 break. This was the trouble, of course. For the paying public, it looked too easy.
And off the white again, bringing the white ball up the table. In off the red, in the centre pocket to leave a drop cannon. Get the balls at the top end of the table.
8.
Drop cannon, leaving the white ball at the top end and the red ball for a pot.
10.
Light a little slowly and off the red, leave another one.
15.
Just a plain ball stroke down the table, in off the red.
16.
In off the red again, leaving a drop cannon to get the balls at the top end of the table.
19.
Just a quiet cannon down the table, leaving the balls at the top end.
21.
Knock the white ball back to the top of the table.
23.
Potting the red, leaving the top of the table plate.
26. 28. 31.
Cannon, bringing the red ball back to the white.
33.
Little kiss cannon.
35.
Slow screw this time, bringing the red ball back to the white.
37.
1 or 2 close cannons to go on with now.
39.
Kiss cannon, driving the white along the cushion.
41. 43. 45. 47. 49. 51. 53. 55. 57.
Little all-round play.
59.
Cushion cannon.
61.
Cushion cannon playing over the ball.
63.
Screw cannon off the cushion, sending the white across the table back to the red.
65.
Thin cushion cannon,
67.
sending the balls out in the open.
69.
Pot the red.
72.
Pot the red and leave an in off.
75.
Cross loser, sending the red ball over the centre pocket.
78.
Potting the red to go at the top end of the table to get the white ball into play.
81.
The difficulty is, once you know, this game is too easy for you. Well, it looks like it. Run through, sending the red ball across the side of the table.
83.
Pop the red quietly.
86.
Popping the red again.
89.
Second pop, the red ball goes on the centre spot.
92.
Popping the red again to go down to the top of the table.
95.
Another spot shot to leave the cannon.
98.
A slow screw cannon, leaving the balls close together.
100.
That's how to make 100 break.
I see, Walter. And how do you make 1,000 break?
Just make 9 more hundreds.
Lindrum went home to Australia with the championship trophy, saying in effect, come and get it. A year later, Joe Davis and McConaughey tried unsuccessfully to reclaim it in Melbourne. The venture was a financial disaster, particularly for Joe. It took him nearly a year through exhibitions and challenge matches to earn enough to get home. Lindrum wouldn't return to England, and the British players realistically didn't think there was much hope in going back down under to challenge the champion in Australia. Clark McConaughey, who didn't have so far to travel from New Zealand, did throw out a challenge, but the match never materialised. So matters remained until Lindrum relinquished the title in 1950. By this time, Joe Davis had lost interest in billiards as a livelihood, and as Tom Newman was dead, McConaughey had to be the #1 claimant. It was decided that he'd play the winner of the 1951 UK Championship. And who should this turn out to be but Fred Davis? The world title match was set for Leicester Square Hall, which was Thurston's under another name, albeit with its handsome facade somewhat altered by a German bomb. The match was set for September 1951, with the rest of the season reserved for snooker matches. But Fred wouldn't play.
Well, it seems strange now, the reason, because nowadays we play snooker pretty well all the year round, whereas in those days we always looked upon billiards and snooker as a seasonal game that operated largely between September and April, or something like that, the following year. And I'd won, as you say, I'd won the UK title, and that gave me the right to play McConaughey in the world's billiards. Well, for one thing, I'd only played in the UK really just to have a game of billiards. It was just one of those things that I just took it into my head that I would like to play a game of billiards, and I entered. I played Willie Smith originally in the first round, and I've been perfectly honest when I said that I didn't want to win, because I didn't think, you know, a great player like Willie Smith, that I had any business even trying to beat him. But he was getting on then at that time, and I did beat him, and eventually won the title in London. But they said that I had to play in September, and in those years, I never touched the cue between April and September. And they said I had to play in September, and I didn't think that, you know, that was the right time to play it. And so I just declined.
So McConaughey played the 1950 UK champion John Barry for the title and beat him comfortably. Back he went to New Zealand with the trophy, and the championship lay dormant for 17 years until Rex Williams, who'd been concentrating on snooker, successfully challenged the by now 73-year-old McConaughey. Williams won a week's match by a mere 265 points. Leslie Driffield, twice world and 8 times English amateur champion, wanted in turn to challenge Williams for the title, but terms couldn't be agreed. It didn't help that Driffield was on the board of the Billiards and Snooker Control Council, which at that time was the official governing body for both the professional and amateur games. The situation got steadily more acrimonious, and the association eventually stripped Williams of his title. The repercussions of this were immense, not only for billiards, but also for snooker, because the Professional Billiards Players Association, of which Rex Williams was chairman, decided not to stand for it. They renamed themselves the World Professional Billiards and Snooker Association and declared unilaterally that they were now the professional governing body. Indeed, they have remained so. Under their banner, Williams made 4 defences of his billiards title and remained champion until Fred Davis beat him in a 4-day match in June 1980, when Willie Smith, then 94, was guest of honour. Fred made a 583 break in the last session, the highest in the championship for 46 years, but of course not a patch on the thousands that Lindrum and Co. used to reel off virtually at will. Snooker was taking off in a big way as a television sport, and there appeared to be some prospect of billiards being dragged along on its coattails. The championship moved from a challenge to a knockout format, and Fred Davis won it again before Williams regained the title in 1982. Williams retained it the following year, but there was an incident on semi-finals day which led to him being fined £500 for misbehaviour. Williams took umbrage at this and hasn't played in a World Championship since, although he did appear in a special television tournament, the Blue Arrow Masters, and duly won it. This was a short game format of half-hour matches designed specifically for the needs of television, but it was rather like limited overs cricket compared to a 5-day test match. The powers that be nevertheless decided that this was the way the game should go, the commercial way, though it didn't turn out to be very commercial. The WPBSA was so financially flush from its snooker contracts that it could afford to subsidise billiards, and leading amateurs who'd hitherto seen little point in turning professional to play billiards alone liked the look of the new scale of prize money. Among them were Norman Dagley, winner of 2 world and 15 English amateur titles, and Michael Ferreira, a Bombay lawyer who'd won 3 world amateur championships. Meanwhile, the attempts to attract television coverage for billiards grew ever more feverish, with the abandonment of the traditional championship formats of playing either a set number of hours or to a large points target. Instead, they chopped up the matches, first a best of 5 400 up, and then best of 7 150 up. This desperate attempt to sell the game as a public entertainment was enough to make Lindrum and Co. turn in their graves.
That doesn't represent billiards as far as I'm concerned. As I outlined earlier, billiards is a game of continuity, and you don't 100 or 150 up that they play today is the sort of game that was played in the clubs between you know, just ordinary club players. But that's not a professional game at all, and I don't agree with it.
Is there a danger that billiards could die, or will it meander on much as it has for the last 50 years or so?
I think it will, because it's a lovely game to play. There's a great deal of pleasure in playing billiards, because I think largely because there are only 3 balls, which can be controlled by good players to a large extent, where they can make huge scoring breaks. So that I think there'll always be a few enthusiasts to keep it going on well on an amateur basis rather than a professional one. I can't really see it coming back as a professional public image.
Television continued to ignore billiards. Sponsorship was difficult to attract, and the public remained indifferent. The trouble with billiards is that its skills aren't on the whole eye-catching and conspicuous, but delicate, subtle, and to a considerable degree repetitious. However, on the amateur front and as a player's game, there's been a modest but encouraging revival, and up in Middlesbrough, two outstanding young talents have emerged. Peter Gilchrist, who won the British Open in 1989, and Mike Russell, the European and UK Open champion in 1988. The North East is Britain's major billiards stronghold, and the Teesside Boys Billiards League, which produced both Gilchrist and Russell, is a unique institution. It runs on Saturday mornings when clubs throughout Teesside make their facilities available to young players before official opening time. The league's produced 4 current professionals, and it's an idea which could do with being copied elsewhere. Gilchrist and Russell were among the 16 players who assembled at the Fairmont Resort in Lura, New South Wales, up in the Blue Mountains, about 80 miles from Sydney, for the 1989 World Professional Championship. Gilchrist and Russell, in fact, reached the final, which was contested over 2.5-hour sessions. Gilchrist led by 300 points after an hour, but by only 36 at the interval.
41.
Just as a matter of interest, Mark, we had a problem in India where people below the age of 21 were not allowed into the billiard rooms of our clubs until the government insisted that we hold a junior championship. And all the clubs were then compelled to revise their rules, and now we have 12-year-olds playing the game.
India's most celebrated player, Michael Ferreira, talking, and among those watching, twice world professional champion Norman Dagley, beaten this time in the semi-finals by Mike Russell. Russell went ahead of Gilchrist early in the second session of the final with a break of 457. Here he's playing the postman's knock variety of the top-of-the-table game.
53.
The idea of this is to get the object white tight on the cushion behind the red spot. The cannon is made full on the white to keep it pinned in the same position. Russell kept it there for lengthy spells as he made the break of 593, with which he clinched victory by over 900 points, thus becoming the youngest ever champion in the championship's 120-year history.
63.
So billiards, constantly written off by premature obituarists, not only survives, but is modestly flourishing.
65.
Peter Gilchrist could only sit and watch this time, but there'll be others.
68.
Having twisted championship billiards out of its natural shape to make it more attractive to television, lovers of the game are starting to be more philosophical about the game by going back to traditional match formats which make no concessions to the uncommitted public. It would be nice if the great god television smiled on billiards a little more, but if not, it'll still survive because it's such a lovely game to play. Through years of neglect, it's still kept going, and at grassroots level there are now more players and more tournaments than there have been for years. So the short jennies, the cushion run-throughs, and all the special skills which give billiards its own flavour and individuality will continue to be passed down to succeeding generations.